Hey everybody, welcome to the Raptors weekly podcast. I know that the release dates have been different. It's my first year as a full-time beat writer. Paying attention to the games, writing stuff more often does make it so that the podcast just has to fit in where I can fit it and where the guest can fit it. And so that's what this is. And today's guest from The Ringer, co-host of The Answer and writing features up and down the NBA, Seerat Sohi. And we're here to talk about the Raptors. You were in town. Actually, let's do how you doing first before I go to the
I'm great.
basketball
I'm
thing.
great. I'm great. And how are you?
Yeah, I was about to stiff arm humanity there. I think it's just go straight
That's
to
okay. I
the.
mean, we've been talking for like 5 or 10 minutes before this, but yeah, just so the listeners know, Samson is actually like very nice and like we
Oh,
it took a while for us to get to the podcasting portion of this. So don't worry, you don't have to perform the hey,
all
how are
right.
you part of this. We've done
We
that.
Yeah, we don't
He's
have
a
to be
great guy.
pals for consumption. We just be pals. That makes sense. So to start the season, you were in Toronto. We worked some games together along with all the rest of the media. Took in some Raptor stuff, talked to players, did the whole thing. I got to ask you, being around the team at the start of this season, you've covered the Raptors in and out as a league-wide person, and then a little bit closer with the team prior to this. And I'm like the team. Thoughts on their progression from not the championship season, but
Mhm.
since the championship season to now, I'm curious, what are the big takeaways for you?
Ooh, that's a good question. I feel like things have been so up and down for this team in that period. There was obviously like the catastrophic Tampa season that probably sticks out to me as a low, like to everybody. Probably everyone involved with the Raptors, their staff is probably like that. That is that was definitely the worst period of it from like for a lot of different players too. Like Pascal had that really tough bubble playoffs. A lot of injuries, but they're just incredibly scrappy at the same time. Like the Raptors are a very weird team to watch. Like they're really fun to watch at times because they're really frenetic and they're always not always. I think this is kind of well maybe we'll talk about this later. I think they're kind of coming up to the end point of how far effort can get you. But they've always been just scrappy and they've always done interesting stuff. I love like the height experiment. I think we're also now getting to the point where you got to question some of its drawbacks too. I think we almost like this season feels like transitioning or an attempt to transition into a new chapter here, right? But for the most part, I'd say you watch them and you're like, oh, they're down 17, and they've missed like I don't know, they made like one shot in the last 4 minutes, and it looks like there's just no momentum, and they're probably going to lose this game. And then 4 more minutes pass, and you're like, holy crap! Like they're just like defending all over the place, and you basically can't pass the ball anywhere, or they're going to deflect it, and they're getting it going in transition. Now all of a sudden, the shooters are popping off too, and like, my God, is this team streaky, right? And somehow they just did that for an entire season and ended up winning like more than half their games, which makes perfect sense actually when you think about it. But probably the team in the NBA that I think relies the most on momentum, if that makes sense. You know, like it's always like one thing has to lead to another, and I'm kind of at this place now where I wonder if a little bit more structure wouldn't be helpful.
It is really interesting, this team. Before I give my big thing, you talk about the limiting returns or diminishing returns of height or effort. Do you think they have on the roster the talent and or ability to structure themselves to get over those diminishing returns? Do you see that on there?
That's a good question. I think they haven't been healthy this season. I think 20 games of health will have a better answer to that. And 20 games of like whatever version of Pascal Siakam that we've been getting, if you put him into an offense and you get like everyone else to play around that, I think that's very promising. But I think there's also probably some tactical stuff that they can do too. Like it sometimes just feels like I think this season especially, Pascal came in. he was like, I want to be all NBA. I want to be a top 5 player. OG, by the way, OG, first time in his life, like actually like putting his goals out there
Hmm.
for public consumption, and look what's happening. Love
Anything
that
for
for him.
public consumption, to be
Yes,
honest.
it's great. It's great. And Scotty too, just second year. I think there's a lot of stuff that he worked on this summer. He wanted to prove that he could make the leap too. So I feel like I'm seeing a lot of tunnel vision on the team right now, and I wonder if maybe just pulling back on that would help as well. And I imagine the coaching staff probably would like to see a little bit more ball movement too. Like one of the things that's been surprising about the Raptors this season is just like they're pretty much every efficiency stat, like they are in the bottom 15 when it comes to passing, and that's just not something that I think you're used to seeing from this team, or that I expected to see from this team. They don't necessarily have like a natural like top 10 playmaker on their team, but they do have a lot of unselfish players that I do think ultimately maybe later on the season might not need to rely too much on each other. Like maybe we get to a place where Scottie's starting to find his game, right? And Pascal continues to do what he's doing, and OG's already had like just some incredible offensive performances this season that I didn't necessarily see coming this fast. At least maybe you don't need to rely on that too much down the line, but right now I just kind of feel like okay, like let's play off of each other a little bit more than we are. But those are just kind of their like maybe that's just early season kinks, but like just that was a very long answer to your question, which is like I don't know. That's it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's you know what? And it's okay to say I don't know in basketball, honestly, because it's so hard to predict anything and there's so much going on. For the listener, if I can, input what I think, some of that structure might be the Raptors, Sierra talked about how they don't pass very often and there's not a lot of structure to the offense. And that's Nick Nurse and the read and react principles he likes to have. They like to work from mismatches. And I understand why they do that. And I understand why they sell out for offensive rebounds. And when they sell for offensive rebounds, it means that they don't run actions on the weak side to, make sure that they occupy the defense there, which changes help principles, which changes how often you can move and pass to the weak side as a bailout to run those second side actions and stuff like that. And the Raptors at this point, despite having, Fred VanVleet has, I guess, been in and out as a creator worthy of giving a bunch of possessions to. He's had his ups, he's had his downs. Pascal is objectively that guy. You want a lot of possessions in his hands. He's not at MVP status. He was injured for too long, but the stat queries that anybody does are going to return basically Pascal and Nikola Jokic and all that kind of stuff. And the Raptors have a lot of talent on the team,
Mhm.
including OG in that threesome as well. But they haven't found the fusion, or they haven't coalesced in the ways that create like a harmonious production. And I think that's where that really plays into you saying they're the most reliant on momentum out of any team, because when they get to play with pace and out in transition, a lot of the half court limitations stop showing up for guys like Scottie or Fred, and they just get to be out in, with Fred out in the open court means he gets jumpers on that left wing. He gets wide open triples. He gets to play make a little bit out to the corners. With Scottie, it means these long loping strides in transition to the bucket, playmaking, all these, no look passes and stuff like that. And with the injuries, we have not been able to see any type of continuity, which was supposed to be one of the big things for the Raptors record this season. They returned so much of their talent from last year. We just haven't seen anything like that. And I do want to like focus in on Pascal. So Pascal basically is like 58% true shooting. He's basically doing like 25, 8 and 7. He's been the usage bumped, the free throw rate bumped, the assist percentage bumped, the assist turnover percentage is better. Everything for Pascal has gotten to a place where it's really, really impressive. I'm curious what you think of Pascal holistically, the guy.
What do you mean?
Like when you not anything specific, but the whole Pascal, like a holistic approach to Pascal's game, the spin moves, the playmaking, beating double teams, the shot creation, the improved jump shot. Just what does Seerat Sohi think of Pascal Siakam, the player, at this point in time?
I mean, he's incredible,
Yeah.
obviously. um, I think I think most Pascal's journey, I think, is really informative about player development in
Mm-hmm.
general. I think when we look at how far he's come, especially with that jumper, especially like, using it in more dynamic ways too, not just spotting up. Um, there has like been a pretty polarizing discussion on Raptors Twitter, it feels like, over the last month about Scottie Barnes.
Yeah.
And I think this goes for all the guys. I think you can even use it for OG too. This stuff is not linear. It doesn't happen right away, and you have to work through a lot of growing pains. You have to work through seeing missed shots. You have to work through seeing like awkward, ugly footwork and weird possessions and stuff. Because that's also like that was a huge part of the Pascal experience for a while, right? Like if you take it back to his first two seasons in the NBA, like he shot 14% from three in his first season. Granted, he took like, probably like like he was basically like zero attempts, right? Then the next season he's in the 20s. And I think that start of his second season, he basically like didn't he miss like just a record amount of three pointers without making one.
Yes, he was the guy who was the ultimate, the intersection of volume and inefficiency. That was Pascal Siakam, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
And I remember every time I'd watch him out on the court, even after a miss, he would still be smiling. And I think you kind of have to have that attitude about failure in order to come as far as Pascal has. Because if you look at it in broad strokes, he's other than the bubble season, he has pretty much improved every single season. But it's come with a lot of growing pains. It's come with a lot of failure. It's come with just like he went to the G League, and it's also a really inspiring story at the same time because there's absolutely no way that I would have seen this guy being able to do the things that he's doing now. Like he is basically like he's like a rebound and three assists shy of averaging a triple double, and that's kind of always been the sort of all around potential that he's had. But I think when you have all around potential, it takes like a few stops and turns to figure out exactly what you should be doing with it as well.
Mhm.
Like how much of his, I think like early too, it's like how much of his shot diet should be coming from the mid range and the three pointers, and like just trying to expand out versus like doing the things that he's good at, which is like kind of essentially the conversation that we're having about Scottie. And that's the challenge of, and also like the benefit of the type of player that the Raptors have really liked over the last like 4 or 5 years. Like this is the type of like multi versatile guy who can kind of do anything. Well, then you still have to then take the time to figure out what's going to be the most productive thing for you to do, right?
Yeah, that's the hierarchy of decision making is not necessarily intuitive in basketball.
Yeah,
When you
exactly.
have when you have a bunch of skills that are emerging, how do you choose which one to try and exact upon the defense at any given point in time?
Hmm.
How could Pascal and the many development coaches, head coaches, assistant coaches known that by building out his mid-range shot, it wasn't an overall, okay, he's going to become a great pull-up three-point shooter. It's more so that he's so comfortable in the mid-range that when he's playing, he can get doubled at a top 3 rate in the NBA, and he's one of the best playmakers in the front court in the NBA because he's so good at decision making out of doubles. And
Hmm.
that's largely because he's so dangerous in the middle of the floor because of his shot making there. Like that's not really a development quirk that you would be able to project.
Hmm.
And neither is like catch and shoot threes. Development coaches, scouts, everybody in the NBA says we can take a guy and he can hit catch and shoot threes now. But the type of things that Pascal has built into his game are completely singular. He took his whole bag as like I talked to Ben Pfeiffer and Ben Pfeiffer had recently went through all of his college tape and was kind of doing like a scout looking back at what would I like about this guy. And it's basically he was a tremendous mover, a unique and
Hmm.
talented mover, a kinetic savant. Yasmin Duwala coined that, I think, way
Hmm.
back in 2019. And he's built all the skills on top of that. And so it's bubbled up into just a completely singular player who there isn't anybody like him in the NBA, I don't think, prior to him or like him currently. And that doesn't mean he's an MVP, but it does mean he's singular. And that's something cool to achieve. And it also means that people might think that like he becomes the blueprint for development, but the point is that he isn't. He's like just a one-off, a branch coming out of the bottom of a tree or something like that. Completely
Hmm.
unique in that facet. He fascinates me, probably the same way he fascinates you.
Yeah, I mean, even if you think about that early spin move, which I think is actually also really an important aspect of development, is having a few things that allow you to stay on the
Hmm.
court. And for him to be so elite at one particular thing that was really hard, even after it was scouted for defenses to stop. Now, granted, they did get better at it, but it was still really difficult. And there are certain guys where you might know it's coming, but you're not going to be fast enough to be able to stop it. That kept him on the court, and that was always such a like there's a spin move and then there's the Pascal Siakam spin move, right?
Hmm.
Like it's just a different deal, and it was always really fun to watch. And then you think about he played soccer early and he was a late bloomer to basketball as well. And he has developed in this really like I never actually thought about that, just how like the singularity of his game. I almost wonder if that also makes him a little underrated when we have discussions about
Okay,
there we go.
Seerat. The term is called aesthetic bias. When somebody doesn't imitate the stars of the past,
Okay.
it's harder in your brain to accept that what they're doing is elite. I've been working on this theory for some time. I'm
Okay.
very glad you brought it up. But yeah, aesthetic bias is the term. And for people, I'm sure you've seen, I guess, like be it like footy Twitter or basketball Twitter, how they, I believe Joel Embiid was referred to as a free throw merchant. The merchant tag gets attached to people. Somebody who is not very impactful, but does echo the aesthetics of past stars. You would call them an aesthetic merchant. So we're
Interesting.
working in all the little
Interesting.
colloquialisms now.
Who is like an aesthetic merchant?
I don't want to be rude. We
Come on.
okay. So Gary Trent Jr., for example, is
uh,
not necessarily an aesthetic merchant. And I just wrote today about how he's been so much better about attacking closeouts and manipulating with his own gravity.
mhm.
But it's kind of like he hit a lot of step backs, and there's nicknames for him within. Big shout out to Zarar, who started Raptors Republic. But before last season, we had a conversation about Gary Trent Jr., and he said he saw a little bit of Kobe in him. And it's just like it's because of the step backs and the shot
Mhm.
making that we chunk them together. Raptors
Yeah.
Twitter affectionately referred to Gary Trent Jr. as Gary Beal, although Gary Beal attacks in a completely separate way, and Gary Trent Jr. has very little presence at the front of the rim and all this kind of stuff. But when somebody makes the types of shots that like DeMar and Kobe and Michael Jordan make, we immediately start associating those skills with like the highest level of play.
Mhm.
And so I don't mean to call Gary an aesthetic merchant or anything like that, but just to kind of illustrate where that point comes from or
I'm
something
thinking
like that.
about guys that didn't
Ooh,
necessarily
Cam
pan
Reddish.
out. Yeah, I was actually just about to mention him, like about the like all these 6'8", 6'9" wings that you would think were gonna go in and be like. I think Paul George is also interestingly a guy that became a model for development for these guys. Like you
Even though he's
can't.
impossible to recreate.
It's I actually think it's because it's somewhat possible to recreate his
You
game in
think?
the way that not completely, but in the way that you can't model your game after Kevin Durant.
Hmm.
You can still model it after Paul George. You can copy a lot of his moves. Like I think like Tatum is somebody who when you look at his game inside the perimeter, especially early on, like he definitely modeled some stuff off of Paul George. There are a lot of guys kind of in that size ilk that you know were taking those like working around like just curling around for like an 8 footer and taking advantage of their height that way as opposed to like always going down and trying to draw a foul at the rim, especially as you get older. um and I think Kawhi is another guy that people try to look at as a developmental model too. Him, I think, is it's harder because his elite strength is just something that's really difficult to replicate, even if his game looks like simple and replicable. Kevin Knox. I just thought of Kevin
I
Knox.
was gonna say that one. Yeah, yeah,
This does feel a little bit mean because I'm just like going down these previous drafts and being like, who did everyone think was going to pan out and be a star, but
yeah.
didn't. But this is actually a major problem. Like I've talked to scouts about this before too, where like when a guy looks like a certain guy, it sucks for the guy too because he gets pigeonholed because everybody just
Hmm.
gets lost in the hype and they're like want to say, oh, he's going to be the next this, he's going to be the next that, where you don't necessarily actually take an honest look at his actual skill set and think about where that could fit in an NBA roster, right? Like one of the things that we we do at the answer now is like we've been looking at some players that have been, you know, or were supposed to maybe be stars and it didn't necessarily pan out. But Dennis Smith Jr. is a guy where everybody was like, oh yeah, like he's going to be like the next, you know,
Hmm.
John Wall, next like
Right.
explosive scoring point guard, and like all along he was never efficient enough for it. He was never a good enough scorer for it at every level. But the thing is, he could get into the lane and do it occasionally, and it would look really explosive and awesome when he did it. So that's what we look at as potential, as
Hmm.
opposed to looking at like taking a more broader perspective on, okay, well, how often does that happen and what are the circumstances under which that happens.
Yeah.
I really like this framework.
Yeah.
It's cool. It's like I feel like it's very informative.
Yeah, aesthetics. I think I had this conversation. I did a series last year of podcasts where I talked to a bunch of people about why they love basketball. And there was a lot of different reasons. Some of it was aesthetics. Some of it was like the drama of basketball. Or Yasmin had pageantry as
Mhm.
hers. Caitlin Cooper, there's a bunch of them anyway. But I think Paul George, the reason why, of course, you're correct in saying that there's things that people have picked up, but there's the Bruce Lee quote about water.
Mhm.
Like the cup, the water becomes the cup.
Mhm.
You can flow or you can crash like a wave. And Paul George, the way he drives at his size, I feel like it's like water running down like a rigid mountain where it doesn't have a predetermined path whatsoever. It's just
Mm.
taking whatever pops up, and it's like Paul George has the flexibility, fluidity, and skills at his size to do that. I've never seen a guy like him move at that size. And here's the segue: a guy who does not move smooth, who's actually quite truncated, powerful, but truncated. OG Ananobi.
Mhm.
We talked about how he's introducing himself as a guy this season, saying, "Hey, I'm good at stuff. I'd like you guys to say I'm good at stuff too. Maybe you should say that more often now because I'm saying it." All that kind of stuff. If anybody wants to go to raptorsrepublic.com, I have the quotes, I have the film, I have all the stats, and this one I is not behind the paywall.
Mhm.
You can read about OG Ananobi from my end there. But more important than that, what does Seerat Sohi think of OG Ananobi's defense and offense so far this season?
I think you'll probably have better insight, to be honest. But I think it all kind of just comes down to him saying it himself. Like this is all just, I mean, like Yasmin said, like the pageantry, the NBA, especially when it comes to things like defense, people don't pay like like enough genuine attention to defense like through the course of a season. You kind of have to create a little bit of your own narrative if you want an award like that. But like the example that always sticks out to me is Derrick Rose in his MVP year. He came out at the start of that season saying like, why not, why can't I be the MVP of this league, like why can't I be the best player in this league. He had zero business believing that, by the way, like zero. He came in like he had a great season. He was an all-star coming into that season, but there was no reason to believe that he was going to make a that he made a huge leap that season just in his game in general. It wasn't all just hype, but it was also like this perfect collision of Dwight Howard had a better season than him, but nobody wants to give it to a center, and
Mm-hmm.
especially nobody wants to give it to Dwight Howard, although he wasn't quite as disliked as he is now. And LeBron James just went to the Heat, so like there's no way that he was getting it. Um, so yeah, it just kind of goes to show, man, like a lot of this stuff just kind of comes down to like you putting yourself out there and saying it. Because I mean, OG has been this, like on defense, he's been this guy, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I think he's definitely better, right? But do we think that the percentage point to which he has improved like correlates with the level of hype he's getting? I don't think so.
No, definitely not. And it is talking about it really. I did I did this piece I think 2 years ago during the bubble season where the Raptors were the second ranked defense but didn't have an all defensive member selected. And I went through so many of OG's possessions And just it was astounding. I guess that would have been his 4th year in the league, how or I guess no, his 3rd year in the league, how impressive he was at not only not getting scored on, but suppressing shot attempts from stars. Like it's
Mhm.
he plays against LeBron. LeBron just doesn't shoot as much. And of course, some of that is the Raptors being very help oriented in scheme, but OG is a guy who will limit the stars not only statistically with, efficiency, I guess, but also will make sure that they leave less of a footprint on the game. Most notably, we saw that probably with his performance against Luka Doncic, where once again, very help oriented scheme from the Raptors, a lot of blitzing, but they blitzed when the pick and roll came. If it was Luka Doncic running anything else besides pick and roll, OG was in denied defense or he was playing up on the ball as a single defensive player, doing all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And it is just a guy. He's a little bit more, I guess, gamble heavy as far as in passing lanes this year. I would say that's resulted in a higher steal percentage than usual. But the cool thing about gambles is if you're doing it really well on defense and you are an elite athlete and you have elite measurements and you have an elite feel for the game, the gambles are not so gambly. They're
Mhm.
more of a certainty, right? And so he's just getting more steals
Yeah, and
and he's
especially
not
when you have
giving
a
up a lot.
backline behind you that like the
Mhm.
Raptors at their best on defense. Not to say that they've been at their best this season, but at their best, like are incredibly intuitive about helping as well. So if a gamble doesn't necessarily pay off, you've got to scramble. And I just trust the Raptors in scramble situations more than I trust your average team as well.
Mhm.
But I think OG is also he's somebody who he's kind of the perfect modern defender. I think over the last 5 years or so, one thing that's become really important for defense is just being able to absorb a lot of weight from the other guy. And like I think like him defending Luka Doncic, like that is kind of the perfect example of it, right? But we saw it firsthand, just like how Kawhi would punish guys in 2019, right? But you can go down the line. There's LeBron, there was Harden in his prime. Um, Over the last 5 years, it just feels like most of the elite offensive talent in the NBA, probably because on some level you just have to be able to get through the grind of a season, is just heavier. They're heavier, they're
Mhm.
stockier, they're not. They use the post in interesting ways. It's not like your grandmother's post up, but it's like it's a sort of different way of just I think utilizing their gravity by getting into the middle of the floor, being in a position where it's advantageous if they force a double, um, and also just the way that pick and rolls are run too. It's just you can you can bully guys on your way to the rim if they're not stronger than you, and if you're smart about it, you're not going to get much like a charge call, right? And I think this is actually only going to get this is going to persist, right? Like the Raptors just got like the Pelicans beat the brakes off of them with
Mhm.
with Zion essentially doing that to the whole team, right? And like if you look at a team like Memphis, they've done a really good job of putting together a lot of stocky defenders that can switch a lot of positions. And usually like this is like the weird secret where that allows it all to come together. Usually these players that are larger, you would think that they would have a harder time staying in front of other people, but their hip strength gives them so much lateral explosion that they can
Mhm.
usually stay in front of guards too. And I think that's what you see with OG as well. Like to go from Luca and then like deal with a guy like Trey. It
Mhm.
seems like it shouldn't work, but that part is like really the secret sauce to me that allows him and like there's and the elite defenders in the league to guard pretty much anyone.
Can I actually, just as a complete non sequitur, you brought up Trey, and having read your piece on the Hawks. Okay, so you have a quote here, and I thought it was really great, and I have a question about. So it's, um, so there have been trade offs. While Murray and Young have an easy symbiosis on defense, on offense they're like an Orange County wife married in quotation to her aging oil baron husband, playing together in that they exist in the same space. So had you seen something with oil barons recently, or do those exist at like the front of your mind? It's such a unique thing to bring up. Like one of the greatest villains in American history, the oil baron.
So I had actually gone to a comedy show in Irvine, California, which is, I think, in Orange County or Orange County adjacent.
Mhm.
Um, Comedian is Ashley Gavin. She's hilarious. Everyone should check her out. That'll be my plug. But she was basically, she just does a lot of crowd work, and she was basically making a comment about, like, well, she was basically flirting with one of the women in the audience. It was like an older woman who was, I think the woman had said she was married, and she was just basically like kind of made a joke about, well, like, are you're married, but like, are you married?
Yeah.
And that's I can't remember what the exact joke was, but she basically made a joke about um, the quote unquote marriage, like, or like the quote unquote marriages that exist in Orange County. And I do think she used oil barons as an example. And my editor actually was like, hit it with a bit of a question mark. And he was like, "There's a lot of oil barons in Orange County." And I was like, I actually did some research, and it turns out that in the early 1920s there was. So my response was, well, most of them are probably dead now. But yeah,
Return
thank you
to
for the
the earth.
question.
Yeah. Return to the earth to become the oil they so crave.
Hmm.
Um, what
Yes.
like
Wow.
what does the term oil baron conjure up in your mind? I think of like Doug Dimmadome. You know that you like the
I think
that
of.
character?
I don't. I don't. Who is that?
You know, so do you ever watch Fairly Odd Parents? You know the guy in the white suit with the big
Oh
hat,
yeah.
Doug Dimmadome of the yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah.
That's who I
Wow.
think of.
Wow. Did you ever watch the OC?
So, I'm aware of the OC. I've been
Okay.
adjacent to enough OC people. I have not watched it myself though.
Okay. I think of Caleb from the OC, who was played by Alan Dale. He was like the kind of the patriarch of the Cohen family, and it was also just like written as the worst. Like, he was just this guy who was, he had a whole bunch of properties in Orange County, and he was like, yeah, let's tear down this, the Balboa Natural something something, I don't remember exactly what it was, and build some golf courses. And yes, I'm corrupt, and like, yeah, so maybe you've covered up for some really shady things happening, and with people who work in construction. Yeah, so that's who I think of, not necessarily an oil baron, but somebody who kind of, portrays all of those traits.
Allegories, facsimiles, all of that.
There you go.
I wouldn't be able to get you out of here without talking about Scottie Barnes.
Mhm.
Just curious on what your thoughts on. I did a video for Yahoo Sports that if anybody wants to go watch on their YouTube channel, you can. It's about his playmaking. I won't talk about that too much here because once again, we're here for Seerat. And yeah, Seerat, I'm curious. Scottie Barnes, we're like 20, I guess for him, 20 games, 22 games into his sophomore season. What are your thoughts?
Not too surprised. First of all, I think he's just been dealing with injuries. I have a lot of questions about why it is that he is just limping across the floor all the time.
We
That
keep
just is
asking. Coach
incredibly
just says
strange.
everything's fine. It's kind of
It's
absurd.
it's really weird. I don't get it. He's really young. I feel like maybe just give him 5 days. Um, I've also heard he's like just like the type of guy who won't stop. So maybe like that's just going to be something that he has to learn.
He's a grinder. At the game the other day, he was walking out like I swear he left the arena before Nick even had his press conference.
Hmm.
Scottie Barnes was gone, and all of a sudden I see on Twitter people say he was already watching the highlights from the game on Twitch. He's a content creator. Like he knows nothing but the grind.
Yeah, I mean that's amazing. Yeah, I mean I've heard just like kind of like late night gym stuff about him, and that's great. That's really great. Obviously, you want to hear things like that, but I just like that's part of the adjustment also of like becoming an NBA player too. Is like you gotta reconcile a little bit with like the fact that your body isn't quite invincible. And I think for a guy like him whose body is held up incredibly well for him for the most part, that might be a little bit harder of a challenge too. The other thing is just it's like the Pascal thing, right? Like when you are trying to be the guy who does everything, there are going to be some stops and starts. There are going to be some times that you take some paths that maybe didn't necessarily like weren't necessarily the right ones, right? But that's kind of part of the journey. Um, there were points earlier this season where I felt like he wasn't necessarily playing with a lot of joy either, which was concerning. It feels like that has been back too. He's just more energetic, and like it's just tricky, right? Like how do you kind of build on all this stuff that you're probably excited to show off, that you've been working on, that you're also going to have to develop as counters, because now the league has been put on notice. They know what Scottie Barnes is about, right? Like he's not going to get every easy backdoor cut there is. Like guys are going to be looking for it. They have been looking for it, right? Like there's a reason. I think Scottie has left some cuts on the table, but there's also a reason for that too. Like they're not giving him that anymore. There's a reason he has to be like spotted up at the 3 point line. Um, when I've seen from his shooting progress, I like it. I think like it's just kind of about putting it all together, like kind of putting together last year's game, which was all like energy, effort, hustle, athleticism, chaos, like
Hmm.
into a more sustainable game moving forward, right? Like because you can't do that forever, right? As awesome as that stuff is, but it's still his bread and butter. It's still going to be the stuff that he needs, and it's also the stuff that's winning basketball. That's why he got the comparisons to Draymond Green, right? And you wouldn't tell Draymond Green to go then try to become Kevin Durant, right? And I feel like that's kind of what happened with Scottie over the summer. And now, if those two games actually like find a way to mold together, then that's incredible. Then you have like this do it all guy who's going to be completely unguardable. And honestly, I think that's worth going for. I think we've seen so much in his touch to suggest that he could be a very high level scorer. He's incredibly smart. He can be cerebral in the half court. Transition, like you already know. And I think like whatever path he's on is worth it. I think it's just a matter of finding ways to be productive and do the stuff that you're already good at while you're exploring new parts of your game. And that's all a lot easier said than done. Like I feel like let's just like if you're a Raptors fan, just kind of embrace the mess of it for now and hope that it leads to something beautiful in the future.
Embrace the mess of it. I do enjoy that quite thoroughly. Now, I've been telling people that the vibes of the fan base do not necessarily reflect the vibes of the team. As somebody who's around the team on
Mhm.
occasion, I think the vibes have been pretty good. But I could be a homer. I could be doing all that kind of stuff. So I have to ask you: you've been around teams in the NBA. You've been around the Raptors this season. Are you good at assessing vibes? And if so, what were the vibes
Let me
like
ask my
for the
therapist.
Raptors? Yeah.
Um, I will refrain from touching on whether I'm good at assessing vibes, because I feel like if I say that I am, that's probably just going to mean that I'm not. If it's like one of those
Right.
things. I do think the vibes on the Raptors are good. They're fine. I don't think they freak out nearly as much as the fan base does, which is really good. I think that kind of comes down to Nick Nurse, right? Like Nick Nurse is really steady. He's like, even when he's pissed, like he's pissed and then he's like not pissed after, which is good. Like it's a long season. You got to get through it, especially the amount of injuries these guys have had. Like I imagine it's not even fun to be like creative at this point, because it's like, gosh, like could we just have a few more tools to work with? Yeah, I think the team is fine. They generally bounce back pretty well from losses. They don't really like delve too much into it. They got a pretty productive relationship with their own weaknesses and stuff too, which is important. And I think that's just like that's probably also a Nick thing as well. Um, it's weird. I think sometimes like it's almost more reassuring for fans to see the team have the same level of quote unquote urgency
Mm.
as the fan base does, but I think that can lead you down some pretty bad paths too, right? Like those
What was
that
it? Kevin Durant was on Twitter, and there was a guy tweeting about Kevin Durant and saying like he's getting MVP, Ben is getting Defensive Player of the Year, the Nets are gonna win it all, and Katie responded and was like, "This team is gonna break you. You need to take a break. This team is gonna break
you'll
you."
like for real though, and I think like when it comes to actually trying to solve problems, you do need to have that level of perspective and some level of remove from it too, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't always just be kind of catastrophizing and thinking about like, oh well, I think there's kind of a tendency in sports to look at what's happening now and assume that there's some sort of permanence to it, as though like people
Mhm.
don't have bad games and good games and bad stretches and good stretches. Like that's just kind of a part of life. um, and we always want to come up with solutions to things, but sometimes the best thing to do is just do nothing and wait.
I imagine it's extremely helpful that the leaders of this team are Pascal, who we his metamorphosis from who he was as a player and the way he responded to criticism or praise transformed in front of everybody,
Hmm.
and in a very, like, in some cases, like a very nasty way, not on his end but what he was subjected to. And there's like a significant amount of perspective and calm that he brings to the way he talks about basketball. And Fred is a guy who came into the league through the back door, undrafted at every turn, had to prove himself, had to work, had to. So these guys are not unfamiliar with significant problems,
Hmm.
kind of jumping up in their basketball lives, and they both came through it and found accolades on the other side. So I imagine they're very instrumental in keeping everybody on the, I guess, the steady going
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah, steady Freddy. He's
Yeah.
also a truth teller.
Yeah.
I think he sees things very clearly, and I think that's probably what the most important thing is. Like, regardless of what your attitude is, as long as your attitude isn't, you know, preventing you from seeing things as they are, you're probably fine.
Hmm. Yeah. That's Pascal Siakam. Everything, even Nick Nurse, the pressers lately has just been talking about, well, process is pretty good. And I know process is not exciting for most people to talk about.
Hmm.
We're kind of into outcomes in this world,
Yeah, for
but
sure.
processes inform future outcomes typically, so we can find solace in that, I
Yeah, and
suppose.
it's yeah, for sure. And it's good to, be able to have faith in them even when things are going down. I imagine for fans it's probably a little bit annoying, like when you see a really bad effort and you see Nick Nurse just kind of like shrugging and be like, I don't know, like just doing his like kind of like aw shucks Nick Nurse thing. But that's
Yeah.
in the long term, that's probably a good thing. Like there's a reason a lot of teams flame out. There's a reason a lot of coaches flame out. Like you can't get too. This is like the ultimate cliche of the NBA, but there's a reason it's like a cliche. You just can't get too high or too low. Like you got to just
Hmm.
keep it moving, right? I think Scottie works as a good example of that too. Like if he had those bad games and like started reading Twitter and was like, oh, like look at what everyone's saying about me, like like the potential downward spiral of that is pretty bad. Whereas like you just keep doing the work, hope the shots fall. Eventually, they probably will.
Yeah. Don't read the internet. Try
Don't
not to.
ever like
Not.
that's what everyone. Don't ever read the internet
Yeah. That's
unless you're
not
reading
only.
Samson, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah, yeah. That's right. Um, I think it's plug time, Seerat. If you'd like to plug anything, or tell the listeners, the viewers, where to find you, what they should be keeping their eye on, anything like that, you go right ahead.
Well, I co-host a podcast called The Answer. You can find it on the Ringer NBA network. I co-host it with Jake Kyle Mann. And thank the Lord for that because he is a lot smarter than I am. But we have fun. We have fun. We like to kind of theorize. We like to pick one topic of the week and just kind of dive in, so think about what it means. We talked about Zion Williamson this week, and I imagine Raptors fans might have had enough of Zion, so maybe tune in next week when we're not talking about somebody who's personally violated you. Check out the answer and check out the Ringer. We do a lot of fun stuff. I have a Raptors thing coming out eventually. I'm not too sure when though. So
The specter of something on the horizon.
yeah.
That's right. Sirit, thank you so much for hopping on. It's been an absolute pleasure. I feel extremely happy that I got to introduce aesthetic bias to you, and I'm
Me
excited.
too.
I'm excited for you to pontificate openly upon it for the rest of your days. Um, Listener, if you're listening on the podcast channel, thanks for letting us talk to you. Thanks for listening in. YouTube channel, hey you, like the video. That's supposed to help. Subscribe, and more importantly than anything, go to raptorsabove.com and subscribe to the website so you can access my written content, Louis Zatzman's written content, and Aiden Moss's weekly 5 things I like and don't like. Whoever you like the most, do it for them. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And yeah, we'll see you.